I'm going to take Trent Horn's how Protestants argue like atheists, and I'm going to raise him how Iconodules argue like heathens. So Iconodules have lately applied this very same tactic of overcontextualization. We've established the nature of context, why it's necessary, but then also the problem of overcontextualization. And now I'm going to submit that actually Iconodules, in the recent online debates on icons and iconodulia, have taken a page, or rather a whole volume really, from the homophile eisegetical playbook. And not just homophiles, but people who support women authorities in the church, people who oppose head coverings, many groups who do the same sort of erroneous tactic. Just as pro-sodomy scholars and apologists use a wider cultural context to drown out the immediate meaning of a text, likewise do iconodules drown out the reasoning of multiple church fathers and the scriptures, but we won't touch that today, on idols and images by appealing to a specific cultural belief, one which, while valid and necessary to account for, is demonstrably not the total extent of the patristic rationale against idols and image worship. I have actually formalized the kind of argument here and then demonstrated the formal equivalence of the homophile and iconodule argument. So the fallacy formalized is as follows. Because author A said Y in context Z, Y is only applicable to context Z. So for homophiles, this looks like, because Paul wrote Romans 1:26 and any number of other passages in the context of temple prostitution or abuse of homosexual relationships, Romans 1:26 is only applicable to temple prostitution or homosexual relationships. Likewise, we see iconodules. Because, insert father here, condemned image veneration in the context of pagan idolatry, those condemnations are only applicable to pagan idolatry. Now, something I'm happy for here, I'm not just, there's a big problem when people try to draw an equivalence between certain arguments. I see it very frequently, where people can actually contrive and end up actually strawmanning one side's argument in order to make it look equivalent to another argument that they're trying to compare it to. But in this case, I genuinely believe I didn't have to contrive anything at all. I obviously had to formalize the form so you can see it more clearly. But this is actually, this iconodule argument, it's very brief and it's very brief and not with all the details they give, but it's not inaccurate. This is actually what they argue in sum, that, hey, this father condemned image veneration in the context of pagan idolatry, therefore those condemnations are only applicable to pagan idolatry. And now, again, I need to stress, sometimes there is a valid appeal where, hey, look, this father, his rationale is, in this point, is specifically with respect to a certain aspect of pagan worldview, so thus his condemnation does not necessarily apply to iconodulia. Fair enough. What I am arguing against here is how this attitude is then applied in order to pave over rationales which actually can transcend that context and go into iconodulia. Exact same problem with homophiles, with their homophile argumentation. They are appealing to a real context, but they are paving over the rationale which Paul actually gives, which is much deeper than just the contextual instantiation of homosexuality that may be present. And even the very claim that temple cult prostitution and domineering relationships were the only kind of homosexuality, I've seen that challenged. I don't think that's even true. Yes, you can see that there is actually a formal equivalence in their kinds of argumentation, and they fail for the same kinds of reasons. Both summaries accurately above accurately represent certain arguments from certain parties and are formally equivalent. And it's actually very easy to see why that kind of argumentation fails just in normal human conversation. Saying something within, we all know from experience, I'm willing to say that saying something within a certain context does not necessarily restrict what we say to that context. And so I have a little analogy, a little analogical story to demonstrate that. So let's say there's a local infestation of a certain wild animal, and a young man's father tells that young man, his son, not to drive, not to drive a bright red car that they own at night, for the reason that it will be seen by the wild animals and they will give chase, at best damaging the car and at worst injuring the driver. Now let's say that son also owns a bright blue car which his father does not know about. does his father, in this circumstance, does his father's command also apply to the bright blue car? According to the fallacious reasoning given above, it does not, because the father's command was only in reference in the context of a bright red car. The son is otherwise free to drive a bright blue car because the father wasn't talking about that. He wasn't even aware of it. But this reasoning is, of course, false, because as established earlier, the father's rationale for the command is not limited to the red car. That is, it's not on the basis of a red car or a car being red, but on the car being bright and obvious in nighttime conditions. Thus, even if he was not aware of the bright blue car, the father's command likewise does apply to that bright blue car because of it sharing the quality upon which the command was based. And the father would have every right, therefore, to discipline his son for going out at night in that bright blue car. So I'm hoping this really clearly demonstrates the issue here. There are circumstances, there's many you can think of, wherein a command, and all this stuff is mostly in reference to commands because we're talking about application in other contexts. Otherwise, someone simply saying something like "sees across the Rubicon," you can't really apply that elsewhere. It's just a statement of historical fact. But when we're talking about commands intended for distant audiences, this is where this becomes relevant. And we can see this here in this analogy. Anyone could probably think up of any number of scenarios where, if you're parents in particular, you can think of any number of commands you give to your children, and you know instinctively, and you expect them to know instinctively that it's not just applied to a certain instance. So if you tell your kids, for example, "Hey, buddy, don't put your hand on the stove here. Don't do that. It's going to be hot." Since you're only talking about that stove, is he therefore allowed to touch another stove at a different person's house? Obviously not. You are actually making a command based on equality, even though it's only instantiated in a certain instance at the time you make it. So that's the key problem at hand. This is why the absolutizing tactic of Iconodules, homophiles, egalitarians, multiple other heretical groups, this is why they fail. Anybody who makes a hermeneutical error of this kind, this is why it fails, because it utterly destroys how human language actually works, how we actually communicate, and the intention of people giving commands. This is why this all ends up failing. Don't put your hand on the stove, proceeds to put face on the stove. Exactly. That's another example. The examples are limitless. All you need to do is just find a command where it obviously applies to something which is not identical with the example I gave, but it still obviously applies. And so that ultimately is the error of this tactic. You need to actually respect the author's rationale, the author's reasoning. You cannot just confine him. You cannot just imprison him within a certain context in which he operates and then say otherwise what he says is completely irrelevant to outside context. You can't do that. That's not necessarily the case. Again, there can be instances where the rationale is restricted to a certain context. Let's even use this example here. The animals in question are cartoon bulls, will therefore only chase red cars. So let's say that the father, that was actually his rationale, because the wild animals outside, they like bright red things and they will give chase to it. Otherwise, the command probably would not apply to a bright blue car. Actually, it wouldn't, because the father wouldn't be intending that, whether he's right or wrong. So there you go. We can think of any number of examples. It's just intuitive. It just really is intuitive. And anyone who says otherwise, and I don't think anyone would say otherwise, is an absolute joker.